Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well this morning. Let me just share my screen here. Thanks for joining us today. It's really quite a lot of fun to do these lectures, as I keep saying, and we're now halfway through. This is the fourth of a series of 6, and so you've managed to power your way through the first 3, and we have 3 more to go. Today's session is on cracking the Enigma coding machine, and I hope you'll enjoy it. And at the end, we'll answer as many of your questions as I possibly can. And if we have some from some of the previous weeks, we can go through some of those as well. So let's get started with this week's seminar. Today, our story actually dates back to Samuel Morse and Guglielmo Marconi. You've probably heard of those two people. Morse, in 1830, he invented the single-wire telegraph machine that you've seen people in the old Western movies using to tap out signals. But actually, it was when he invented the Morse code, which is the series of dots and dashes, that things really started to take off, and that the telegraph became quite useful. The next guy that came along that really advanced the technology was Marconi, who in 1901 invented the radio. And with that, a huge problem developed. And let me describe it in this manner. When a naval ship would leave harbor, would leave home port, the captain would get his orders from his commander. They would be written on a piece of paper. He would leave home port, maybe sailing to the other side of the planet. And if his orders were to be changed by the people back at home, they would have had to send a ship to catch up to him with new orders because there was no radio. But when Marconi came along and everybody put a radio on the ship, all of a sudden they were able to communicate from the other side of the world back to their home base. Only one small little problem, and that is that when home base sent out the message in using usually Morse code, well, everybody could hear that message. And so the need for codes came about as a result of this desire to keep the message traffic secret. And here is when the cat and mouse game started between those that are writing the codes and those that are cracking the codes. And that's, of course, what today's story is based on. In fact, today's story stayed secret for nearly 40 years after the end of World War II. This truly was one of the best kept secrets of the war, and you'll soon understand why. Winston Churchill, he wrote after the war that history was going to be kind to him because he intended to write it. And in fact, as many of you know, he actually did. After the war, he wrote a 6-volume compendium on World War II. Volume 1 was published in 1948, and Volume 6 wasn't published until 1954. But for his efforts, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature that year. Interestingly, if you read that book, or those books, the word Enigma doesn't appear on a single page, and neither does the word Bletchley Park, where all of today's story actually unfolded. They do not appear in the books that he wrote, and there's a very good reason for it, which we're going to get to in a minute. In fact, no one spilled the beans for 40 years after the war, which was covered actually by a period covered by the Official Secrets Act. An author by the name of Winterbottom in the 1970s, he wrote a book that was based on material that he stole from the British archives. But when he was writing his book, he couldn't get a single person to talk to him. Not anyone would sit down with an interview with him to talk about the story of cracking the Enigma codes. Only after the 40-year period ended did anyone directly involved sit down for an interview. That's how long it took. And today, of course, since then, there's been a lot of many excellent books that are written on this subject. And of course, as I've said previously, I will put a list together and add it at the end of the seminar of all the books on all the subjects. Now, Bletchley Park, where all of this took place, only opened as a museum in the early 1990s. And over the years, it's become a world-class facility with a working decoding machine and actually even a working computer that was called a Colossus, which they built in the the middle 40s, just before the war ended, to crack the German High Command's Lorenz codes. And this is also on display at Bletchley Park. If you find yourself in London on a rainy day, you definitely should go. Bletchley is about 30 miles north of downtown, maybe a little more, but you can get there by train. Quite an interesting museum to visit. And of course, since it's raining in England virtually 100% of the time, there's really no excuse not to go, because at least you can get out of the rain. breaking the enemy's codes always gives you a big advantage when you're in a war, but when you're breaking them at a time when the enemy is strong and you are weak, it actually allows you to concentrate your limited resources and provides a critical advantage that might otherwise mean the difference between you winning or losing the war. Now, this was very apparent in World War II with the British breaking the German ciphers. The greatest mismatch in military strength was during the beginning of the war, when the Brits and their allies were relatively weak compared to the Nazis. The first opportunity for the Nazis to knock the Brits out of the war came during the summer and fall of 1940 with the Battle of Britain. And there were really three legs of the stool that kept the British in the fight. The first was the intrepid men and women of the RAF, who on a daily basis rose up in Spitfires and Hurricanes to chase off and shoot down the marauding German fighters and bombers. The second was radar, and in those days, the code name for British radar was called chain home. You can see a picture of it here on the slide. This gave the ability for the British to know when the Germans were forming up and generally to know which direction they were coming from. But the third leg of the stool was actually cracking their Enigma codes, which now gave them exactly the information about where the marauding Germans were heading. And that allowed them to take their limited air force and send it to exactly the right spot at the right time to get the maximum possible results. And this is one of the reasons why the British were successful in winning the Battle of Britain. The second and probably even greater opportunity to lose the war came during the Battle of the Atlantic. And here, being able to read the German signals definitely saved the day. From 1939 until the end of the war, 377 convoys sailed from Halifax at 10 knots. 200 more convoys sailed from a tiny little town north of Halifax called Sydney. And those ships were smaller and less powerful. They sailed at only 6 knots. 6 knots is about 8 miles an hour. So they literally crawled their way across the Atlantic. In the early part of the war, they were sailing without much air power or air cover to keep a watch on them. And they often were sailing with just a few escort ships to protect them. Countless millions of tons of ammo, trucks, tanks, artillery, men, food, fuel, everything needed to fight the war was all loaded at ports up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States and sent to either Halifax or Sydney, and then these ships would depart for England. These convoys, when they left from Nova Scotia, sailed directly into waters that were infested with hundreds of German U-boats. Now, Germany began World War II with fewer than 30 U-boats, but over the next 4 years, they went on to build 842 more. Now, of those 842, 741 of them were sunk. 30,000 of 36,000 U-boat crew are on the bottom of the Atlantic. 5 out of 6 were killed in action, which was the worst survivability of any branch of the Nazi military. The U-boats, turns out, attracted the most ardent Nazis because it was so dangerous. Like Japanese kamikaze pilots or even today's suicide bombers, these guys were total fanatics. They really, as a group, are only missed by their fellow travelers and maybe their moms. But they caused so much damage, it's unbelievable. More than 2,000 Allied ships were sunk, most of Canada's Navy, and more than 80,000 men were killed. If you visit Churchill's underground war rooms in the Admiralty in London, which is another great place to go visit if you're there, you'll see an enormous map that tracked the transit of every convoy coming from England from North America. Now, it's not an accident that this map is front and center on the wall in the bunker. It's there because these convoys were literally the lifeblood of the war. Just in 1 month, in March of 1943, 95 merchant ships, 2,000 men, and 570,000 tons of material were sent to the bottom by Karl Dunitz's U-boats. The U-boats were hunting in packs like wolves going after sheep. And all of this chaos was the direct result of the German Navy making a very small change in the way they were using Enigma. Bletchley Park went dark at the worst possible time, and it took months to break back into the German signals. When Bletchley could read the German naval signals, they could make subtle changes to the shipping routes and try to avoid the U-boat packs. When they couldn't read the German signals, the convoys were seemingly stumbling into the U-boat infested waters with terrible results. Except it wasn't quite the accident that they thought it was. The Germans had actually cracked the British merchant marine codes, and they knew their intended routes as they were departing from North America. So the Allies thought they were having bad luck. No, it's wrong. Their signals were actually compromised. And worse yet, for long and repeated periods during the war, when the Germans added various features to the Enigma machines, Bletchley went blind. The U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than the Allies could build them. So if you want a recipe for how to lose a war, it's to run out of fuel, food, and ammunition in the middle of the war. So this was critical that they were able to read the German signals. Now, if all goes well with today's plan, all of you will be able to get a job cracking codes and ciphers, because of course this is always one of my goals, is to find you all jobs, just as you've now been approached, some of you I'm sure, by the North Koreans to help them build an atomic bomb. You're going to eventually get the contacts from people who want to help you crack codes. So let's back up and talk a little bit about the history of all this. What exactly is a code? On this slide, you can see some examples of a very simple code book that I've created here with some numbers representing words. You can write out a code, which basically is essentially 2003, which would be my, and then 9845 name, and you get the rest of it. And then you send that with Morse code to your person who's on the receiving end, and as long as they have the secret code book, they can turn around and decode it all, and you get a message, a simple message, my name is Richard. Okay, so the British naval codes, which was used by the Navy and Merchant Marines, actually was a book like this, not quite like this, because it had 50,000 5-digit codes. And as an example, the word attack might be 45798, and U-boat might be 78934. So this was how they would send codes back and forth to each other. This is what a basic code is. Now, the next slide here shows you what a cipher is. A cipher is a little more complicated. Here you take the alphabet, and in this particular example, I used something quite simple. I just took the alphabet and added 4. So A, add 4 letters to that, and it becomes E. B becomes F, and Z, when you add 4 to it, it becomes D. So now the sender sends the same message, and you see here Q, right? You pick a Q, and that turns out to be my name. Well, if you want to, you want to write my name is Richard, so you take M, and that becomes Q, and then C becomes, Y becomes C, and eventually you spell out the code QC, which is essentially the coded version of this. The recipient receives that message, and in reverse fashion goes back to the code book and reverses the order, and you get the same message. Now, the good news here is that now that I've explained all this, you're all about to get drafted to work in the UK's Government Communications Headquarters, which is called the GCHQ. And as I'm writing here, you all pass, and you should all immediately start packing for, well, rainy weather, because of course the one thing we all know about England is that it's going to be raining. Okay, now that you're experts in all of this, let's talk a little bit about some probabilities. The probability of winning the Powerball, if you're buying lottery tickets, is you have 1 chance in 292 million. Now, how about the probability of picking a perfect bracket, which is March Madness? This is 64 teams playing all the way down to 1 winning team. The odds of you just picking that randomly is 1 in 9 million. So really not that very good if you're just going to pick randomly. But what about the probability of cracking a 4-wheeled Enigma machine? How about 1 in 158 million. So if you're just randomly trying to do this, you're going to have a very tough time. So hopefully today I'll be able to explain to you how they managed to do this. But again, let's back up a little bit and talk a little bit about codes in history. And to do that, I want to talk about this thing, the Zimmermann telegram. Back in 1914, a German mine layer at the start of World War I ran aground in the Baltic. The Russians ran on board and realized that they had found 3 copies of the German Navy's code books. They took one, kept it for themselves. They sent one to the French. They sent the other to the British, where it ended up in room 40 of the Admiralty, which is where the Codes and Cipher Division was based. The British also did something very clever during World War I. The Germans had an undersea cable that ran from Europe to North America that they used for sending Morse code traffic. Well, the British actually took a ship, went above the cable over the water. They sent down a diver, and he cut the cable. And that forced the Germans to either use a Swiss cable or a US cable. Those were the three cables that were running from Europe to North America in those days. The Swiss cable and the US cable, however, they actually came aground in England. So they went from Europe across the English Channel. They came up out of the water in England, and then they went back under the water back over to America. Now, the British, despite having an agreement not to do so, of course, given the desperate situation, what do you think they did? They tapped the cables. So the Brits were reading Germans' naval conversations throughout World War I and much of their diplomatic traffic as well that was going through that cable. And what happened? Well, in January of 1917, a guy by the name of Nigel de Grey, who worked in room 40 of the Admiralty, he walked into his boss's office that he told them that he had just decoded a message between Berlin and the German ambassador to Mexico. And he said to his boss, you know, if we want to get America into this war, I think I just have the thing that's going to do it. And he handed his boss a copy of what became known as this Zimmermann telegram, which was a telegram that was sent from a top civil servant in the German Foreign Office to the German ambassador in Mexico. Maybe you know this story, but this is how America ended up in World War I. It's become known as the Zimmermann telegram. And what it says is that we intend to begin on the 1st of February as unrestricted submarine warfare. We'll endeavor, in spite of this, to keep the U.S. neutral. In the event this does not succeed, here comes the good part. They make Mexico a proposal of an alliance with Germany on the following basis. They'll make war together. They'll make peace together. Generous financial support from Germany to Mexico, with an understanding that Mexico is to reconquer, get a load of this, the lost territory of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. They then go on to try to get the Mexicans to approach the Japanese to pull them into the whole situation. And of course, this telegram ends up on the desk of Nigel de Grey. He goes to his boss. It goes to the United States, and it ends up on the desk of Woodrow Wilson. And this was the event that caused Woodrow Wilson to finally tell the Germans, that's it, we're joining the war, and that the rest is history. Now, that's the good news about the Zimmermann telegram. Here's the bad news. After the war, the British made a huge mistake. Jack Fisher, the first Sea Lord, and Churchill, the first Lord of the Admiralty, they wrote books detailing their exploits during the war. Now, maybe it was because they thought World War I was going to be the war to end all wars, or for whatever reason, they did it. They actually made mention in their books about the fact that they had managed to get a hold of the German code books and that they had cracked their codes and were reading their mail throughout the entire war. Turns out that was not a very good idea, because one of the people who read that book was Karl Dönitz, the guy from the German Navy. And he vowed right then and there that if it would never happen again. So Dönitz spent the next 12 years trying to come up with a system that would be uncrackable. And this led them to this machine. Now, Enigma is a Greek word for riddle. And one of our own OLLI members, a guy by the name of Bill Eisenhower, he recently filled me in on the early history of the machine. An early version appears to date all the way back to 1915, and it was designed by two Dutch naval officers, a guy by the name of Spengler and Van Hagel. But it was Scherbius who managed to first successfully commercialize it. He first sold it to the German post office, who used it to send encrypted business communications, and then he made a version for the German armed forces, which was adopted in the late 1920s. So this is what a three-wheeled Enigma looks like. You can see these are the three wheels that we talk about. You'll see here it actually looks like a typewriter. In fact, this is a keyboard that looks like a QWERTY regular keyboard. And when you pushed a letter, a light above it would light up with the coded signal. And I'm going to explain in some detail exactly how that thing works. But first of all, here's another picture of the three-wheeled Enigma. So you pushed a letter. This is the letter A. Let's say you pushed that. What would happen then is that the signal would flow out of the front of the keyboard here through this thing that was called a plug board. It would then go into these wheels. I'm going to, again, show this in more detail. It was then reflected back through the wheels and then sent back through the plug board and then over here to this lights, and the lights would light up. And if you pushed an A, then a B might light up, or a C or some other letter would always light up. This was one of the beauties of the Enigma, is it was done in a very automated fashion. Now, here's what a four-wheeled Enigma looks like. This Enigma was used beginning in 1942 by the Kriegsmarine, but it was made even more complicated with the addition of these wheels. The thing to keep in mind is that every time you push a letter, what would happen is that this wheel here on the right would index one click. So then you'd push another letter, and this wheel would index another click. And after 26 clicks, which is every letter in the alphabet, this second wheel would then make one click. And after it moved 26 clicks, then the third wheel would make one click. So you could type out very long messages, and the message would always look totally garbled. And all you had to do is set the machine back up to the way it was initially, and you could both code the message and decode the message. And I'm going to show you a little bit more about that here in a few minutes. Here's what, again, the machine looked like from the top. Again, it looks just like a regular QWERTY keyboard. Of course, in Europe, the Y and the Z are exchanged for some reason that you have to ask a European. But it's basically a standard keyboard. This, as you push the buttons, would flow through the plugs at the front, up to the wheels, through the wheels, back to a reflector, back through the wheels, and then back through the plug board, and it would light up a light. Again, this is what the wheels look like. Let's talk about them for a minute. So the wheels were the heart of the machine, and the fact that they indexed. Basically, they were electrically connected to each other, so that when the signal came in on the right side of the wheel, let's say it came in as a letter A, as it went through the wheel, it would come out, say, an R, and no two wires on this side were connected to the same letter on the other side. So A was never connected to A, B was never connected to B. And they were just all made so that on one side it read one letter, and on the other side it read another letter. Now, when they first started using this machine, Scherbius only made 3 wheels, but he had to make the same 3 wheels for every machine. So if the Germans ordered 1,000 Enigma machines, they got 1,000 typewriters, and they got 1,000 sets of these 3 wheels. The machine wouldn't work properly, of course, unless wheel 1, let's call this one wheel 1, every wheel 1 was identical. The wiring on the wheel 1 was the same, the wiring on wheel 2 was the same, and the wiring on wheel 3 was the same. So initially there were 3 rotors, and then they decided to expand that, and they went to 5, and then they went to 8 different rotors for the Enigma machine. So eventually they ended up with 8 available rotors. A 3-wheeled Enigma, required the operator to pick first initially 3 wheels, and then for the Kriegsmarine they went to a 4-wheeled Enigma. So the order counted, the order of sequence in how you place them into the machine counted, and then the starting position of the wheel. I'm going to show you what that means in a minute, and that was set daily. Now let me explain the plug board on the front. The plug board on the front had all of these connectors, and now these were 2 wired cables. So think of it like the power cord for any appliance you might have in your house. Every cord, it had 2 connectors on it. So in some cases, A might be hooked to W. You had 10 cables. So the system came with 10 cables, and it essentially allowed you to scramble 20 of 26 letters. So on a certain day, B might be hooked to U, E might be hooked to P. So this was another way to totally confuse the situation with 10 different cables, each randomly hooking 20 out of 26 letters. And so this is what a wiring diagram looks like. And so here I can show you again, you pushed a letter on the keyboard, it went through the plug board. Let's say it went in as a C, it might come out as a V. It comes up here as a V, goes into this wheel. Let's say it goes in as a W, and it comes out a B. It crosses over to the next wheel, goes in an R and comes out an S, whatever. It goes all the way through, goes back to the reflector, and then all the way back through again, back down, back into the plug board, and then it lights up a light. So that was the basic way that the machine worked. Now the trick was, as long as you had for every message on a single day, if the whole machine was set up the same way, you could decode or code messages at will, because at the start of the machine setting, as long as you started on the first letter of the message, the machine was always set so that the letter that you were going to encode became the ciphered letter, And the opposite was also true. If you typed in the ciphered letter, the clear letter would also light up as long as the machine was set exactly the same way, because that's how the circuit was hooked together. So let's explain how that worked a little bit more detail. So what the Germans did is that they circulated around a code book. And in that code book, this one is an example of the page for January of 1944. And let's pick on the 31st of January. And what this code book is telling the operator to do is to pick these three wheels, which was wheel 4, wheel 1, and wheel 5. So this was the sequence in the machine: far left, middle, and right. So these were the three wheels that they were supposed to use. And then the ring setting was which was the letter that was supposed to be on the top. So the simplest way I can explain that is that the letter B, being number 2, A, B, should be at the top. And when I say at the top, what I mean is that you would have seen a B sticking out of this little window here so that you knew it was set properly. So if we go back to the diagram, then this is the 10 cables on the front. So if you count these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, A was hooked to W, B to P, C to I, you get the idea here. And this was how the operator knew that the machine was set up. And so when he started sending his message, he would always set it up back to these settings, and then he would just start typing his message, whatever message he wanted to in cipher. When the receiver of the message got that message, all he had to do is to know what these settings were, set the machine up exactly the same way for the start of deciphering the message. And as long as he did that and started at the first letter of this in the message, the clear text would show up above where in lights, just in the opposite manner as it was coded. Now, how did the operators know which settings to use? Well, this was a little bit complicated. So what they did is that for each day, in clear text at the top of every message, they used one of these 3-letter codes. And this told the operators that on January the 31st of 1944, the message would have needed to be set. If you at the top of your message said XED, then you knew that message was actually using the settings from the 31st of January. Now, why did you need to know that? Well, if you're a radio operator, you might be sitting there with a pile of messages printed out on paper. You don't necessarily know what day that message arrived. It could have arrived a day ago. It could have arrived 2 days ago. So in order to figure that out, with this clear label at the top, let's say they had MSR at the top, it told you that, oh, that message MSR that I'm looking at right now, well, that came from the 24th of January. Therefore, I needed to use these 3 wheels, 3, 1, and 5, set with the top positions 7, 14, and 4, and then these plugboard positions. And this was the simple way that it all worked. So, I mean, now you guys are literally experts. Okay, so let's try a few simple messages. If you received this ciphertext and you deciphered it using whatever the daily signals were from the Enigma machines that I just showed you, you might get this plain text. Now, the thing to bear in mind with all of this is that you needed to be able to speak some German, because, of course, they're not sending messages in English. So this is what it would have said, and you can see here that the letters are all just strung together, and you then have to go through and you have to then parse it into the words that form the actual message. And what this one particularly said is that they were attacking they're attaching themselves to U-4701's convoy, and it's signed by U-boat 2338 by the captain whose name was Kaiser. And it turns out Captain Hans-Dietrich Kaiser was the captain of U-2338, and on May the 4th, 1945, he actually was sunk, and he had not been a very successful captain in that he had no ships credited to his sinking. So this essentially covers an explanation of how the Enigma was used, and explains a little bit about why it was so complicated, because with all those wheels spinning, made it very difficult for someone trying to decipher it. And you saw the probability of the odds of what it was to just stumble into a solution were astronomical. So turns out the Poles were the first to gain some insight into how the Enigma machine worked. They were busy cracking German communications from the early 1920s onwards, but in 1928, when they adopted the Enigma, suddenly everything changed, and the Poles were all of a sudden unable to read the German signals. And so were the British. Both the Poles and the British at the time correctly surmised that the Germans had adopted some sort of a mechanism to make their codes more secure. The Poles, however, were not going to be undeterred or deterred. They went and paid a French intelligence officer a bribe to go and bribe a German officer. And so for 10,000 Deutschmarks, the French guy bribed the German guy. That's about $1 million, by the way, in today's money. And the German provided a full set of operating manuals for the three-wheeled Enigma. Now suddenly, the Poles had a wiring diagram. Basically, the wiring diagram I just showed you, they had a copy of it for a working Enigma. Now, Poland's code breakers at the time were three guys named Jerzy Rzycki, Henry Zagalski, and Marian Rajewski. And they were all employed at a place called the Polish General Staff's Cipher Bureau, which was based in Warsaw. Rajewski was a pretty smart guy. He took things one step further by building this electromechanical machine to help search for solutions. Sort of looks like an adding machine. For some unknown reason that's lost to history, he called it a bombe, spelled B-O-M-B-E. I don't know why. It looked, as I said, like an old-style adding machine, and it had a hand crank on it. You could spin the three wheels of the Enigma, and it would light up when a solution came up that yielded a clear text message. In September of '39, when the Germans invaded Poland, the Polish codebreakers realized that they better flee or they were going to get stuck behind German lines. And so they took off with their manuals and this machine and headed for England. Unfortunately, when they were making their way from Poland to England, they had a close call with a German unit, and they dumped the machine and all their papers because they were worried about getting caught with all this stuff. They thought they might have been killed, so they threw it all away. But they still showed up in England with what they had in their heads, which was actually a lot. The Brits, of course, were eager to learn everything they knew, even if they had lost their machine and the wiring diagram, but they were able to recreate most of what they had from memory. But the Brits never let the Poles know anything about Bletchley. Even the Poles, who had cracked the Enigma before the Brits, were never allowed to actually work in Enigma. Before the war began, the Brits had also had some success in breaking into the Enigma codes, but nothing like the Polish success. They knew enough to know that with war coming, signals intelligence against the Germans again was going to be important, and they also knew it was not going to be the cakewalk that it was in World War I. Churchill at the time realized that because of his own mistake, his loose lips were partly to blame for this. And so this is one of the reasons why the Brits threw an entire security blanket over the entire decoding and decryption effort that they were running during World War II. It's because they had learned this very painful lesson from having talked too much after World War I. So this is where the focus for all the secrecy came from, was this mistake that they had made at World War I. Now in England, the story centers around the Government Code and Cipher School, where, by the way, you should all be receiving a job offer shortly. That's based at Bletchley Park at the time. Now, luckily for y'all, I think it's in London. This house, the manor house that they used, was built by Sir Herbert Samuel Lyon, who was a Jewish stockbroker in the late 1800s. Now, when you go to visit Bletchley, one of the things you realize is that this house is built with a whole bunch of different styles: a Victorian style, a Gothic style, a Tudor style. There's Dutch pieces to it, and even Baroque parts to the design. It's hard to imagine what was going on with the people who built this place, but it may be one of the ugliest buildings I've ever come across. However, it does have such an interesting history. During the war, 10,000 people worked here. 75% of them were women. Very interestingly enough, Kate Middleton's grandmother, a woman by the name of Valerie Glassborough, in case you don't know, Kate Middleton is married to Prince William. He's going to be the king, and she's going to be the queen, I guess, at some point. But anyway, her grandmother, Valerie Glassborough, and Valerie's twin sister both worked at Bletchley. So if you think about the royal family, the fact that most of them have been marrying each other for a really long time, the fact that Prince William has married outside the family and has married someone whose ancestors worked at Bletchley Park, is a very good sign for the gene pool of the royal family. But anyway, Bletchley was known as Station X by those who worked there. That's what they called it. Many of the women who worked there were part of the Women's Royal Navy Service, or WRIINS as it was called. They called the place HMS Pembroke 5. The RAF had their own names for the place. The RAF called it RAF Eastcott, or RAF Lime Grove, or RAF Church Green. If you worked there and you wanted to get a piece of mail, you told whoever was sending it to you to send it to room 47 of the Foreign Office. You get the impression here that they were totally doing everything they could to hide the location and what was going on here. Deception was everything. No trick was too trivial to try to hide the purpose of this place. There were no radio towers at Bletchley. There was only one working telephone in and out of the place. Absolutely nothing visible from the air. Signals to be decrypted arrived by motorcycle from radio intercept stations that were set up and down the coastline. And even the motorcyclists who brought the mail to Bletchley for decryption, they had absolutely no idea what was going on inside the gates. And not only that, but they knew enough not to ask. So let me introduce you to some of the key people. Commander Alistair Dennison was the initial head of the operation, and along with him came key cryptologists that included John Tiltman, Dilly Knox, and Nigel de Grey. And yes, if you remember Nigel de Grey, well, in fact, that Nigel de Grey is the same guy from World War I. Now, these people all had a variety of backgrounds. Some of them were cryptologists. There were chess champions among them. They had a very odd way of trying to recruit people. They were recruiting people who they thought would be good at puzzles. So how did they do that? They would put a puzzle or into the newspaper, and they would challenge people to solve it. If you solved the puzzle, you were to call a phone number with the solution. And if you called the phone number and gave the operator the solution, your prize, interestingly enough, was a job offer to come to work for the government. But of course, there's always a catch. You had to sign the Official Secrets Act, which, among other things, threatened the person with punishment up to and including death for talking out of turn for what became 40 years covered by that Official Secrets Act. Now, Dennison, he recognized that the enemy's use of an electromechanical cipher machine meant that he was going to need some trained mathematicians. And so this is where Alan Turing enters the story. He joined the group from Cambridge on the day the war started. The first woman to join to become a full-fledged crypto analyst was Joan Clark. If you remember the movie The Imitation Game, there was sort of this thing going on between the two of them, but this was just fictional stuff from the movie. They both, however, worked at Bletchley together. When the Poles showed up with their understanding of the inner workings of the actual machine, Turing, he got the idea that he could take that Polish machine and automate it. So he got the idea that he could speed it through the possible wheel settings and help pick out ones that would yield a key that would unlock a German message. So now, however, the situation had gotten way more complicated. The Poles were faced with an Enigma that only had 3 wheels to choose from, but by September of 39, the Germans had now added up to 5 wheels, from which 3 were picked. Now, just this one change, however, added billions of possible combinations. So it turned out that Turing had his work cut out for him. His bomb was truly a marvel of technology for its day. You know, today your phone, like my phone, it has orders of magnitude more computing power than one of these machines did. But in 1940, Turing's bomb was on the leading edge, and without a doubt, at that time in the war, it was probably the greatest technological innovation ever devised by man. Here is what a picture of it looks like. Essentially, these are the 3 wheels of the Enigma machine, and then I'm going to turn this video on, and you're going to see them all spinning. This machine was built for the movie, The Imitation Game, by technicians at Bletchley Park, and if you visit Bletchley, the machine is on display there. So let me show you the video. So in simple terms, what you see here is this British machine working like a series of Enigma machines, but in reverse. And so every one of these 3-wheeled series is like having your own Enigma machine. So they built a lot of these. And by using this automated method, they were able to power their way through a series of combinations until they came up with clear text. And at that point, they could use those settings to decrypt a message. So essentially, this machine just was a bunch of Enigma machines running in reverse. The spinning wheels were wired to simulate the rotors of the machine, and to cut down on the number of possible combinations, which would have required hundreds or even thousands of bombs. The British tried to find special clues. Now, they had a name for these clues. They called them cribs. And a crib was a word or a phrase the code breaker suspected is underlying text that should be somewhere in the message. The code breakers not only had to surmise where that underlying plain text would be, but also how far into the message it would be in terms of the number by number sequences. And so this was how ultimately they would figure out how to cut down the number of possible combinations to check. Let me give you some examples of what those tricks looked like. So Army messages often began with the saying at the top, message number. Air Force messages often began with to the group. So you could run the bomb until it showed up at the start of the message that said to the group, and then you realize, aha, that's a setting for this message. Nothing to report was often sent out as a message. And messages often ended, as you might expect they might, with Heil Hitler. So they looked for that a lot in the message cribs. There are a few more. Weather ships often sent out messages that said all clear, of course, because the weather was all clear. So they often had the same format. When they wanted to talk about the wind being south-southwest at 22 knots, you could kind of figure out where in the message that signal was supposed to be sent. Now, another mistake that they made was that old Enigma machines often sent the same message as a new Enigma machine. They did that because they weren't quite sure which group had which machine, so they would send it in using both machines, and that turned out to be a damaging thing for them to do. The other thing that they did that they got very clever at was to design something called a pinch, which essentially was them going someplace where they could steal information from the Germans. And they got quite good at this, and they needed it because in several cases it played a key role in allowing them to break back into the Enigma codes. So let me explain a little bit about that. It turns out that Turing figured out pretty quickly that he could cut out hundreds of millions of permutations if he had one set of the 5 rotors that was used in the Enigma machine. So, as I was just saying, where do you think you'd go to get those rotors? Well, actually, you could try to steal them from the Germans. But you had to steal them cleverly. If the Germans learned that you had stolen their rotors, they would realize, wait a minute, they are interested in their rotors. That meant that they would be clued into the idea that we might be cracking their machine. So they had to steal the rotors in a way that left the Germans in the dark. And to do that, the story now shifts to MI6, which is Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service. They already had an office at Bletchley, and in that office sat 2 guys, Ian Fleming and his boss, whose name was Admiral John Godfrey. And they ran the Naval Intelligence Office at Bletchley. Now, Ian Fleming's name may be known to some of you. He became a famous author after the war. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen his movies, which starred people like Sean Connery and Roger Moore. Turns out Fleming was actually the author of the James Bond books. But Fleming, during the war, worked for MI6, and it was him and his boss that figured out how to get Turing his rotors. What they did is they went to talk to the naval base in Scapa Flow, which is way at the north end of England. At the time, the Germans were always trying to break into the Scapa Flow naval base to sink the ships that were at harbor there. And so what they did is they asked the destroyers that were guarding the port to be on the lookout for U-boats. And if they could get one to the surface, maybe, just maybe, they could board the U-boat while it was sinking, send a guy inside, run to the radio room, grab everything that looked like a typewriter, grab anything that looked like a wheel, and bring it all back out. So it just required that someone jump onto the sinking U-boat that might have been blasted to the surface and then get that stuff before the thing actually just disappeared under the sea. Well, you know, what could possibly go wrong with that plan? But it turns out they got lucky. And in February of 1940, a U-boat, U-33, was trying to do exactly what I just described. They were trying to sneak into Scapa Flow, and it came across the HMS Gleaner, which was a minesweeper. 2 hours later, the U-33 was in fact blasted to the surface. The German radio operator, of course, his job was to throw all that stuff out. If he was going to get off the U-boat and save his life, he needed to be darn sure he threw the Enigma machine into the water along with all the code information. But he accidentally left the 5 rotors in his pocket, and he jumped into the water with the rotors still on him. When he was pulled out of the water by the British, of course, they took everything that he had. The British sailors on the Gleaner didn't know what anything was, so they just threw all this stuff onto a table in the wardroom. And when the captain came through to take a look at what they'd found, he immediately spotted the 5 rotors that were just sitting there. He scooped them up, and voila, Turing had his 5 rotors. This trick, turns out, was repeated several times during the war. When things got particularly bad at Bletchley, Fleming and Godfrey would go after a German weather ship in the high Arctic, whose purpose it was to send weather signals back to Germany. The reason the Germans had to send weather ships to the high Arctic is because when you're in continental Europe, you don't have satellites, well, you need to have something telling you what weather is heading your direction. So they would send a ship way out to the west, way up north to where the weather was forming up. And this weather ship would send information about what weather was coming in towards continental Europe. The British sent frigates up to attack those weather ships. What they would do is find one of them. The first thing they do is blast down the radio tower, rush on board, capture or kill all the crew, grab the Enigma information, and take off, bringing the crew back to England, back to Scapa Flow, and sending the POWs back to Canada, where they would never be able to get back to Germany to spill the story. If prisoners were caught, sometimes no prisoners were actually taken in these attacks. The goal was actually to get the Enigma equipment and not leave anybody around to tell the tale. So in fact, several of these weather ships were attacked during the times when Turing and Bletchley Park were having a great amount of difficulty in cracking their way into Enigma. The British raiding force, which knew what was going on with respect to the fact that they needed to go and grab this Enigma equipment, they were under very strict quarantine rules. They could never leave Scapa Flow. So the men who were involved in this, the commandos and the Navy destroyers that were based there, they were stuck at Scapa Flow for the entire duration of the war. They were never able to be reassigned to the Europe or to the Mediterranean, but literally spent the whole war there at Scapa Flow. The purpose for that, of course, is to make sure that absolutely no one had any chance whatsoever of falling into the hands of the Germans, because if the Germans, as I said, if they caught wind of what was going on, they might change from using the Enigma to something even worse, and with disastrous results. So this was really a very well-kept secret on the part of the British. Now, eventually at Bletchley, they went on to build about 16 huts and 8 cinder block buildings, each constructed with its own purpose and arrayed around the manor house. Every one of these huts had its own job. You can see here, I won't go through them. But when in early 1942, the Germans added a 4th wheel to their Enigma machine, Bletchley was immediately in serious trouble for much of the second half of 1942. And during that time, Allied shipping losses doubled during that period. The German U-boat captains referred to this as the happy time, and it was all the result of the fact that Bletchley had gone dark. To grapple with the new version of Enigma, the British had begun to work on a new high-speed 4-wheeled bomb. So taking that machine I showed you before, making it a 4-wheeled version, and making it run even faster. But progress was slow, and even as late as the spring of 1942, the British felt they had little hope of success against the trillions of all the new possible wheel settings. And here is where the United States enters the story. At the time, the U.S. Army employed William Friedman, as its key cryptologist. He worked there for many years with his partner, Leo Rosen, and the two of them, before World War II, managed to build a machine that was able to crack the Japanese diplomatic codes. This machine and the decodes that came from it were called Purple. Well, now, that's an odd name. Why do they call it Purple? They called it Purple because the coded and decoded messages were kept, oddly enough, in purple-colored binders. So this is where the name came from. Their decrypted intercepts were actually called Magic. And the U.S. was able to decrypt Japanese diplomatic intercepts throughout the entire war without Japan ever catching on. When Rosen and Friedman tried to crack the Enigma codes, rather than building on Bletchley's success, they actually got sidetracked. They tried to build a machine to crack the Enigma using the same techniques that had worked so well for the Purple machine. And in doing so, it turns out they wasted more than a year of their time. Now, the Navy also got into the act, as was common at the time. The Navy effort had absolutely nothing to do with the Army's efforts. They put the Navy cryptologist, whose name was Agnes Meyer Driscoll, in charge. And from October of 1940, when Driscoll started working on trying to crack the German naval codes, she spent nearly 10 years. She spent nearly 2 years with her team, making very little progress trying to break the German Enigma. She thought she didn't need machine support or a mathematical approach. Rather, she was just going to crack it manually. But eventually, when the Brits showed up in Washington in early 1942 and they saw what was going on, Driscoll actually chafed at their idea that she should start to use their Enigma machine to crack the German codes, and instead just continue it on in the manner that she had already been doing with her failing strategy. For some reason, they were not too interested in listening to the Brits who came looking for help. Of course, the Brits were quite shocked when all this happened. They couldn't understand why the Americans wouldn't want to listen to them. But of course, not invented here is a big deal. And it wasn't like the Brits had plenty of problems of their own. Turing's bomb was so complex, it was very difficult to build. And this was compounded by the fact that the British were literally going broke as the war dragged on. They couldn't afford to build 3-wheeled Enigma bombs, let alone the 4-wheeled bombs that they needed. So it took Knox and Denison several visits to Churchill to explain all this. Finally, Churchill was able to resolve it with FDR. And when FDR intervened in what was the ongoing intramural fighting between the Army and Navy, it turns out he put the Navy's Joseph Wenger, the guy here in the picture, in charge. And Wenger was told to find a way to build the bombs in the U.S. to help the British crack the Enigma and stop the Germans from sinking all of his new Liberty ships, which were taking material to England. So Wenger, the first thing he did is he sent the top cryptologists to Bletchley, where they stayed for 4 months, learned how to use the Enigma machines, and came home with a full knowledge of how to do that. And at the same time, he started staffing up at the Navy to build a new Navy decryption department, which was based at a seminary on Mount Vernon on Nebraska Avenue. Homeland Security now uses that building. Wenger, because he needed to build bombs here in the United States, he went and hired National Cash Register in Dayton to just construct the U.S. machines. The man he put in charge at NCR was their senior engineer, Joe Desch, and eventually the U.S. Navy sent 800 men and women to NCR to help build the machines, as well as 200 civilian employees of NCR. This is the number that they needed to build all the bombs that Desch was going to build. As in the UK, Americans were all sworn to secrecy. Many of them also died without revealing their wartime activities, including Joe Desch himself, who never talked to anybody about what he had done during the war. It was only Desch's daughter, whose name is Debbie, who really brought the NCR role into the public eye. And that was only in the 1990s, long after her father had passed away in 1972. Debbie had been digging through her father's paper one day, and she began finding references to Building 26 at NCR. She found pictures of her dad standing around with these Navy people in front of the building, and pictures of her dad standing with all these women at a place called Camp Sugar. Turns out Camp Sugar was the place above Dayton in the hills where the women were all staying in the evening when they weren't working. She went to NCR and she said, hey, to the archivist who was there at NCR in the corporate office, what information do you have about my father? It seems like he was involved with the Navy during World War II. The archivist, who had what she thought were the full records at NCR, found absolutely nothing. There was nothing left in the archives at NCR. Eventually, Debbie ended up at Fort Meade, which is the home of the U.S. efforts to decrypt signals. And it was only after she pestered the NSA for several years that someone at the NSA called her back and showed them their archive. And in their archive, the true story of her father's exploits were revealed, and NCR's role in all of this came to light. Since that time, several excellent books have been written. Debbie herself still maintains a website dedicated to the women who were working there at NCR. But when Desch originally asked for 200 women, he did so because he wanted them to build 11,000 of those rotors. So the Navy sent him the 200 women that were part of the waves. They were recruited to the project by first showing up for an interview. And oddly enough, they thought, gee, why are they asking us whether or not we know how to sew? They were all being asked if they know how to sew. Turns out the reason they needed to know how to sew was because of the intricate wiring on those wheels. And so this was the test that they were all being given. If they could pass the test, they were sent to Dayton, where they joined that project. George Meade, the top Navy man assigned to Desch's work, is the one who swore them all to secrecy and told them that if they violated the Official Secrets Act, they would be subject to imprisonment and possibly even death. The women would first go on to sew 11,000 of those rotors and then make 10,000 more over the next few years. They then, when they finished that task, started running the machines. So they were involved throughout the entire war. We're going to see an interview with one of them in a few minutes. Desch made numerous involvements to the British design. He first built a 3-rotor bomb, but even before it went into production, Desch had designed a 4-rotor machine. He was quite ingenious. Of course, and if you think about NCR's cash registers at the time, they were also electromechanical marvels, and this is why they were so good at this. In England, Bletchley built 50 3-rotor bombs in 1942. NCR built 150. In 1943, Bletchley built 5 4-rotor bombs. NCR built first 150 4-rotor bombs, then 250 more, then 450 after that. So it really was a manufacturing operation that only America could possibly gear up because of the huge resources that we had and the number of people that were available to Desch to work at NCR. This is what the 4-rotor machine actually looked like. This is the one remaining U.S. machine that's actually stored at Fort Meade in the basement, but it's on display, I think, in their museum now at NCR. The British were so impressed with the Desch machines, they actually gave up on building their own, and they just used the NCR machines. NCR's machines would end up being used at Bletchley in Washington and also at Dayton as well. NCR was cranking them out at 6 a week, and they only stopped in 1945 when there were so few U-boats left that the message traffic was reduced to the point where messages were being cracked in both the U.S. and at Bletchley almost as quickly as the Germans were transmitting them. So let me show you this interesting video from a show that I taped.
The American industrial machine churned out hundreds of these vital machines. What's more, the American machines were improved versions of the originals built in the UK, bigger and faster. They were operated in the greatest secrecy by servicewomen in special centers in Washington.
We were assigned to a building, 2 stories, and in the building, on each floor, were approximately 60 of these machines. And we were taught to run them. They gave us a graph to follow, and we would set these switches to certain numbers. And then came down here to set the rotor wheels, and I realized these were the wheels we were putting together in Dayton, Ohio. So we would put the settings to the numbers. There was a little clip, and you would unclip it, pull the wheel out, and you would set it to the number, and then push it back in and clip it in place. When all the switches were set to the proper numbers and all the rotor wheels were set, we came over here and pushed the button. Then we sat on a stool at the end of the machine for the run, what we called the run. When the message was broken, all of these lights would flash, and then the machine would stop. And at that point, it would print. When it was finished printing and the machine started up again, we would tear it off and rush to the end of the room, knock on a door, and a hand would come out and you would say, "Strike." The hand took the message away. You never saw it again. You couldn't read the message because it was in columns of letters. So apparently, when they took it away, it went somewhere to be decoded.
How long did that go on?
That went on for 2 years, and we kept these machines running night and day for 2 years.
Were there times when you were given like special emergency messages that had to be broken? Were you aware of that?
Oh yes, they would come in and give you one and say, a graph and say, "This is a rush," and you would immediately get to work and set everything. And after everything was set, we had to double check before we pushed the button.
Did you know what you were doing?
I hadn't really the faintest idea what I was doing, but as the time went by, you knew it had something to do with code breaking. So one day I said to my wave officer, "Could you tell me what's going on here? Do you have any idea?" And she said, "Well, I don't know a whole lot more than you do, but I can tell you, I heard someone say, we're breaking the back of the German U-boats." And I remember I thought, oh, wow.
Now, the American contribution to the Enigma code-breaking effort is not often...
So it's really quite interesting. She worked there for 2 years, never really knew what was going on there. As you heard her say, they kind of had an idea that it might have had something to do with breaking the backs of the German U-boats. The official line was that it had to do with tracking inventory, the Navy's extensive inventory. But basically, even if you did figure something out, you were expected to keep your mouth shut, and actually that's actually what happened. Nobody really talked. The entire decryption effort was such a closely guarded secret that actually nobody knew anything about it. In fact, even American and British commanders in the field who were recipients of Enigma messages never really knew where the information was coming from. The information that they received about where the Germans were up to had to be attributed to something other than an Enigma intercept. And often what they did, the standard method of obfuscating had to do with the fact that there were so many spies operating in Spain and Portugal and in Switzerland that much of the information was always attributed to German spies, Nazi spies, that had been turned to the Allied cause in one of those countries. And it had an interesting effect of having the Gestapo running around in Spain and Portugal and Switzerland during the whole war, looking for Germans who were spilling the beans to the Allies to explain some of the setbacks that they were having as a result of these Enigma decrypts. But no general in the field ever knew, including Patton or Montgomery, or ever anyone who had any chance whatsoever of being captured by the Germans, that they were actually the recipients of intelligence that was coming from Enigma. That's how much of a secret it was. And it's a good thing, by the way, that that was the case, because as I'm going to show you in a minute or two, the Germans had actually cracked many of the American and British codes at certain times during the war. And so if they had actually gotten a hold of an American or a British signal that said, hey, we just learned from cracking German Enigma signals that the Germans are going to attack over here, well, the jig would be up, and the whole situation would change dramatically. The Germans never caught wind because the Allies were so careful about always making sure that no one knew where the Enigma intelligence was being used. The good news out of this story is that by 1945, Bletchley codebreakers were sharing their cribs with the U.S. and vice versa on the order of 20 a day. And from what began as a very slow start, British and American cooperation was complete. In fact, many Americans ended up working at Bletchley. A certain number of Brits were working in the United States. So they really were sharing intelligence very well by the time the war came to a close. Many lives were saved during the war from using intelligence from Enigma. This is a list of some of the successes that were had. You can read them here, where intelligence from Enigma was used in all of these battles to the success of the Allies. However, there were some serious setbacks. One setback was that the Allies had knowledge that the Germans were going to attack into Russia. They got that from Enigma intercepts. Churchill tried to warn Stalin based on the knowledge that he had from Enigma, but of course he never told Stalin that it was coming from decrypted German signals. But he did tell Stalin the Germans were coming, and Stalin refused to listen to him. The other big failure was at the time of the Battle of the Bulge, when just at the wrong moment, the Enigma decrypts became scrambled because of a change in the way the Germans were using Enigma, and the Bletchley went dark at the worst possible time, which was just before the Battle of the Bulge, which, as you know, was a serious setback for the Allies. However, on the U.S. side, in the Pacific, there also were some interesting successes from the cracking of the Purple and JN25 codes by Friedkin and Rosen and Driscoll in the United States. Of course, there was some knowledge of what was going on at Pearl Harbor from those cracked codes, but also Midway was a significant victory as a result of code breaking. The attacks in the Philippines, bombing the home islands, and many of signals that had to do with the Japanese emplacements on all those islands in the Pacific. Much of the information came from decryptions of these purple and JN25 messages. One really interesting story comes from the fact that the Japanese ambassador in Germany, who had been privy to the German defensive plan for Normandy, had managed to send the entire story back to Tokyo using the diplomatic codes, and the Allies were reading the German war plans as a result of having decrypted the Japanese signals that went back from Berlin back to Tokyo. However, the Germans had also some success. As I said, they had cracked the British Navy codes and also the British Merchant Marine codes. The biggest failure probably came when an American military intelligence officer by the name of Bonner Fellers, who was based in Egypt, who was given broad access to the Allies' plans in North Africa. What he didn't know is that the American diplomatic codes had been compromised when the Italians had broken into the American embassy in Rome, and they stole what became known as the Black Codes. And Bonner Fellers was busy using those Black Codes to send information back to the State Department, back to the United States. And the Germans were catching wind of everything the British were up to because they were reading the American codes that they had cracked. So this was a problem that also worked against the Allies in certain circumstances, and to some extent as well. So it all just doesn't go one way. Eventually, the U.S. figured out, and the British figured out, that the codes were compromised, and they changed them. Now, Bonner Fellers, interestingly enough, he ended up in the Pacific during the war, and ended up in Japan after the war, where he was a person who reported to Douglas MacArthur in the occupation government in Japan. So he had a long career, and he ended up retiring as a brigadier general. So he wasn't punished for the fact that he had the codes compromised, because it really wasn't his fault. And actually, he himself had gotten suspicious and tried to warn the State Department, but they kept telling him, no, keep using the Black Codes. What they, of course, didn't realize is that they'd been compromised. So this takes us back to this character who I want to talk about just ever so briefly. Turing was kind of an odd guy. He lived in Cambridge, and when his allergies acted up, he wore a gas mask as he pedaled his bike the 15 miles from Cambridge to Bletchley. He was quite brilliant. After the war, he started thinking about artificial intelligence and whether or not one of these machines that he was designing, whether or not he could make it think like a human. He wrote a paper in 1950 called Computing, Machinery, and Intelligence, and he hypothesized something that he called the imitation game, which, as you know, was used for the title of that movie. And he posed the question, can machines think? Can they imitate human intelligence? And in order to figure this out, he came up with a test to test his own theory. And that test is known today as the Turing test, still acknowledged among those who work in the field of artificial intelligence as being the key measure of machine intelligence. But Turing had a secret. He was gay at a time when governments were persecuting people for being gay. They took away his security clearance in the 50s because they said he was a threat to national security. He was arrested and prosecuted. He accepted treatment for his quote-unquote disease, and they actually gave him hormone injections, which left him quite sick and impotent. In 1954, he would sadly take his own life by injecting an apple with cyanide and then taking a bite out of it. That, however, is not the end of the story. Turing's work eventually came to the attention of someone quite famous in tech circles in California, someone who also had an interest in artificial intelligence. Most of you will know his products and probably have one in your pocket. Turns out Steve Jobs, although he never acknowledged that Apple's logo had a link to Turing, you can see for yourself Apple's logo is an apple that has a bite taken out of it, something that Turing had done when he injected it with cyanide. Now, Apple has never admitted that their logo has something to do with Turing. You can decide for yourself. Steve Jobs never admitted it, but if anyone knows anything about Steve Jobs, they realize Steve Jobs never admitted anything about anything. So that didn't have to do with him. Giving kudos to Alan Turing was not in his DNA. But anyway, that's the end of our story today, and it actually ends with your iPhone or your smartphone. So I'll open it up to some questions.
Richard, thanks for that fascinating discussion. Your first question is, how did the British bomb machine know when it had found some sort of solution? Did they manually configure it by entering the cribs, and the bomb was looking for the presence of cribs and possible solutions? If so, was it essentially impossible to break a code without a crib?
So it was possible to break a code without a crib, but you had to stumble onto the clear word solution. So they looked and loaded a series of English sequences into the machine, or German sequences into the machine, which they thought were part of clear language text. So certain words that might actually be common letters that would follow one another in a German clear text word, and they would load those into a list. And if the machine came across one of those sequences of letters in a list, the machine would stop. So the machine would work without a crib, but a crib would shorten the amount of time that it took to get to a clear word solution. The method of how they did this was so complicated, you can read 5 different books 5 different times and still not get a completely clear understanding. Your master's level classes in code cracking will have to wait until you go to the museum and hear it for yourself, or read the book.
Go ahead. I want to remind people they can still put questions in. The next question from Lance is, did Britain sometimes have to delay acting on especially valuable intelligence so not to alert the Germans that Enigma had been compromised? I recently learned that the Coventry bombing story in that regard is untrue.
Yeah, it's true that, yes. So the answer to your question is yes to both things. The Coventry story turned out to not be more myth than truth. That story, by the way, for everyone else here, is that the Brits had decryption information that the Germans were heading to Coventry to bomb one night because they were worried that they had no rational reason to evacuate the city. As the story goes, they let the Germans bomb Coventry, causing hundreds of casualties, which happened when the Germans bombed Coventry. So they did not use their foreknowledge to warn people. Turns out it's not clear that this was ever true. However, it was true that they were constantly worried about using intelligence, and they did delay doing all sorts of things as a result of waiting for a reasonable other excuse for the acting on decrypts. A lot of this was going on in North Africa, where Rommel and Montgomery were chasing each other across North Africa. There were many instances when the Brits had to delay action by 48 hours until they could come up with a better cover story of the delay of a counterattack, or in fact, a major attack. This was happening quite a bit in North Africa. It was also happening especially in the Atlantic, where convoys were constantly being rerouted as a result of these Enigma decrypts. They would sometimes delay the information by 12 hours and just hope that the U-boats, Wolfpack, would not stumble across the convoy in that time. And it was all about trying to obfuscate where the information came from. So there were instances of that.
Deanne asks you, can you briefly talk about the Native American code breakers?
Sure. Okay, so this was a group that was active in the Pacific. During the war in the Pacific, someone realized that people who spoke the Navajo language, it was such a complicated language in terms of how it was expressed and how it was understood by other Navajo, that it was very hard for non-Navajo natives to really learn the language. And so they definitely learned that the Japanese had a very hard time understanding the Navajo language. I'm not actually sure how they figured that out, but it turns out that when they realized that the Navajo could speak to each other in clear language without the hassle of going through an encryption and decryption machine, they put a lot of Navajo native talkers into the Pacific and embedded them with various units on ships and in the Marines and in the Army that was fighting in the Pacific. And they used them for direct communication amongst the groups because no decryption coding was necessary. The Japanese had no idea how to understand what the Navajo were talking about. So it was a very effective tool. Essentially, these Navajo code talkers, as they called them, were talking in code as far as the Japanese were concerned, because they had no idea what they were saying. And they never did figure it out. I'm not even sure that they had much of an effort to try, although I'm sure they were definitely trying to get their hands on one of these Navajo natives to get them to explain it to them. As best I know, no Navajo ever fell into the hands of the Japanese and ever talked about how to speak Navajo, or to help them for that matter. So.
Julie asks, you made no mention of Elizabeth Friedman and her involvement with the Coast Guard. Can you talk a little about her?
Yeah, so Elizabeth Friedman was married to William. This was a husband and wife team. There's a lot about the American code breaking history that I did not talk about today because it gets too long and too involved. A fascinating story. The Friedmans were this husband and wife team of brilliant cryptologists that worked throughout the entire war and even before the war on the U.S. system. The system, America was so screwed up at the start of World War II when it came to these sorts of things. I think the Navy decryption department had I think it was less than 10 people in it before Pearl Harbor. So the entire decryption effort by the U.S. Navy was a room with fewer than 10 people in it. And I'm sure many of you know the story. In the Pacific, Joe Rochefort, the guy who worked on decrypting signals in Hawaii, he ended up taking men who had been on the USS California that was sunk during Pearl Harbor, during the attack on Pearl Harbor, and since those guys didn't have a ship, he co-opted them to go to work in his decryption efforts in Hawaii, and they were running around helping him with decryptions in Hawaii, and he was quite effective using those guys during the Battle of Midway and throughout much of the war. Now, I don't want to start misstating the history of the Friedmans, so I'm going to refer you to a book rather than get it wrong and let you read up on it on yourself. But they had a very successful career, the two of them, and they're quite famous in cryptology history here in America, as is Rosen, the guy who actually was the guy who built that machine.
James asks, what did the U.S. know about Japan's intentions prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Well, so they were rereading the Japanese diplomatic mail. The reason Pearl Harbor became synonymous with a sneak attack is because, for whatever reason, when the Japanese sent the message from Japan to the embassy in Washington that they were breaking off naval relations with, or breaking off relations with the United States, which would have been preparation for war, the signal that the Japanese were busy decoding in Tokyo, in Washington, became delayed. Why? Well, the typist, because it was a weekend, the normal typist was out, and the poor guy that was drafted into doing the typing was so nervous about what he was doing that he kept making endless mistakes. So this delayed the arrival of the message, the decoded message from the Japanese to the State Department in time for the U.S. to have been warned ahead of the attack. So that's why the attack became synonymous with a sneak attack and caused, of course, America to be as pissed off as we were. But the reality is that the U.S. had actually managed to decrypt those signals, but we ourselves were so bumfuzzled in how we were distributing the signals, the intelligence from those signals, that we were not able to get actionable intelligence from the fact that we had already decrypted the information before the Japanese ever even tried to deliver it. So I won't say it's partly our fault, but it was partly our fault that we were sitting there unable to take advantage of the fact that we knew the Japanese were breaking off diplomatic relations. Now, we didn't necessarily know they were about to attack at Pearl Harbor, but it's reasonable to have put these places on high alert, which that never happened, of course, given the fact that the planes were all parked tip to tail on the tarmacs in Hawaii. Now, having said all that, even though there was a sneak attack on Hawaii during Pearl Harbor, oddly enough, Douglas MacArthur left the planes in the Philippines parked tip to tail for 2 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, so that the Japanese could show up in the Philippines and blow up all of his planes as well. And of course, this was 2 days after the war had started. So it's not like we were, immediately called to action when the attacks actually came. So there's plenty of blame to go around.
Thanks. Jim asks, do you think that the Zimmerman telegram was authentic? I've heard it was a forgery by the Allies to get the U.S. into World War I.
So from what I've read, the Germans admitted that this was an actual telegram that they had sent. So I've also read that it was a put-up job by the British to get the U.S. to enter the war. But I don't think, from what I've read, that I don't think history supports that. It does appear to be accurate.
Nancy asks, what was Turing's reputation after the war? Was he recognized for his achievements, even privately?
So he was amongst the people who were involved in the decryption efforts, but as I said, he got crosswise with the government in England for being gay. He had a high secured job at Cambridge after the war until he was prosecuted for indecency. They caught him doing something with somebody, meeting some guy. And when that happened, he lost his security clearance and his reputation was destroyed. He couldn't get a job. And so he, kind of died a penniless in an apartment when he ended up injecting cyanide into an apple. But, his reputation after the war was pretty solid. But since he couldn't get a job, because, of course, most of these people were working on secret projects, all his former colleagues, really could not have anything to do with him. And there was really nothing they could do about it. So it was an unfortunate set of circumstances. I should say that maybe 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a little more, the British actually absolved him of his crime, as they did, I think, everyone else who'd been convicted during those times of indecency for this, for being gay. But of course, this is, 50 years too late for Turing. He was robbed, obviously, of a post-war life of high accolades that he would have had had this not all happened.
We have 2 more questions. We are past the time, but until someone tells us that we have to stop, we'll continue. Kathy asks, didn't the Coast Guard also have code breakers?
I'm not sure about that. I would have to look that up. I really don't know. I'll ask you that question. Did they have code breakers? You can send me a note and let me know that, because I don't know if our Coast Guard had code breakers or not. Really don't know.
And Bill asked the last question, which is, what is your favorite book on Enigma?
Oh, this I have to report back to you later on next week, because I have 5 or 6 of them. So I need to go and look through them again and decide which one I like the most. Actually, I must say the really interesting book I got most recently was a book about the German efforts to crack Allied codes, which I had not known very much about until a few years ago. That has added some extra pieces to this lecture that weren't previously in here. I did not previously know that Bonner Fellers had managed to spill the beans on the Allied efforts in North Africa. That came from that book that I read, and that was quite interesting. I didn't know that. So, the thing about history is there's always more to learn. The more you read, the more you learn. And of course, when you get to be my age, you often forget things. So you get to learn them all over again by rereading the same great books. I don't know if that happens to any of you, but it certainly happens to me all the time. So you get to relearn the same things you learned last year.
Richard, thank you for once again a fascinating discussion, and we're all looking forward to next week.
Next week is the Nuremberg war crimes trials.
And this is Anita Knight. I want to thank Judy for backing me up. I lost internet connection for about 5 minutes before we had to reboot our router, et cetera, et cetera. Other people had something similar, but in general, this session has been going very well. There's one more question that just popped up with
Sure.
a compliment too from Melody. Great presentation, of course. But I have a question too, after I give you Bertha Miller's question. Do you know anything about how Britain's German-born Jewish secret listeners helped win World War II. She has a long article about it. High-ranking German officers who were prisoners of war who lived in luxury in Trent Park were listened to. The estate of Trent Park was heavily bugged.
Yes, I think I was talking about that last week, that the fact that the Allies had taken all these German POWs, high-ranking officers, and put them into Trent Park. There was also another place where they went, the British very cleverly had planted microphones that actually they got from the United States. It all came from Westinghouse. I think it was Westinghouse. Anyway, they were American supplied, and they bugged everything: the lamps, the pool table, the beds, the tables in the cafeteria, the chairs, hundreds and hundreds of microphones. All of these wired up before the Germans showed up. They put these German generals into this place and treated them very nicely so that they would all talk to each other. So when a new arriving POW would arrive, he would spill the beans on the latest news from Germany. And of course, the Allies were listening. Many of the people actually doing the interpretations were Jewish Germans that had showed up as refugees before the war, and obviously had an excellent background in speaking German, and they were doing the translations, as were some of the Ritchie boys that were also refugees from Germany that had ended up in the United States, joined the American Army, ended up back in Europe, and ended up also at Trent Park doing these types of decryption efforts. And this was a huge effort that yielded all kinds of interesting intelligence, not just about the Holocaust, of course, lots of other actionable intelligence about what the Germans were up to that was able to give the British and the Americans a real advantage, especially after D-Day, when they started bagging up lots of these Germans.
I have a question about the Apple logo, which you ended up with a very interesting connection to Alan Turing, his suicide by ingesting the poisoned apple. But you say we learn something every day. I Googled the Apple logo. I was going to ask you, how did you find that connection, that anecdote or story? But Google has some other variations on the theme. There's different theories about how that logo with the bite out of the apple was designed and what it means. So I was wondering if you're aware of other theories too.
It's true that there's no definitive answer on this, which is why I said when I told you this story that you have to decide for yourself, because Apple never admitted it. And as you could tell from Googling this, Apple has still never admitted it. There is no definitive answer as to why the Apple logo looks the way it does. There's obviously some theories, but this is why you can decide for yourself. The one thing you do know is that Steve Jobs followed in the footsteps of Turing down the path of artificial intelligence, wrote papers on artificial intelligence that had Turing. So Jobs knew of Turing, and whether or not he was such an accolade of Turing that he used the Turing story to design the Apple logo, I don't know. But you can decide for yourself how it came about. Yeah.
Interesting historical connection.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was going to ask you was left over from last week. Somebody asked about Victor Plage auf Deutsch. Did you look him up?
I tried to look him up, and I could not find anything that looked like it related to World War II. I'm not sure I got the spelling of his name right, so I need a little bit more information that I can.
Okay, well then if that person is still on the line, we've got 93 participants yet, if somebody remembers that question. Otherwise, here's another question from an anonymous attendee. How did NCR machines get to England?
By ship. They shipped them there by boat on Liberty ships. It was a 10 or 12 day transit time, and so they would send them over by ship. They were way too heavy to fly over, so there was no flying them over. They put them on ships. Interestingly enough, at the end of the war, all these machines, hundreds of them, were all broken up and thrown into the river in Dayton, Ohio, so that they couldn't be, so that no one would discover their use. They even smashed the tools that they used to build the bombs. All evidence of this was destroyed at NCR, which is why it stayed such a secret into the 90s until Debbie Desch went digging. Had she not done that, I'm not sure when this story would have come to light. It would have had to have been some archivist at the NSA that wrote a book. I would imagine archivists at the NSA are not regularly writing books. So it's not clear if when and if this story would have come to light had it not been for her. But it turns out all of this equipment was just literally thrown into the water after the war, except one machine, which was put into the basement at Fort Meade, which is now on display in their museum there.
Well, in honor of Earth Day, I hope somebody retrieved the junk out of the waters. But I think it's 11 o'clock and we could close. We're lucky that we can continue without bumping into another seminar on Zoom. So thank you again, Richard, and we'll look forward to next week.
Okay, next week again is the Nuremberg war crimes trials.
So everybody stay safe, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Chat, let's see.